It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au and the parenting expert and co-host of Channel 9's Parental Guidance. Season 2 is coming up really soon. Today on the podcast, I have the opportunity to chat with somebody that I'm super excited to talk to. Had a couple of conversations with Dr. Ross Greene, an associate clinical professor at Harvard Medical School and the originator of the model in the book, The Explosive Child. More than 500,000 copies of this book have been sold. A new approach for understanding and parenting easily frustrated, chronically inflexible children. I love the book. Ross, you can see the dog-eared, highlighted nature of the book when I went through it, and it's just a delight to be able to talk with you today. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
I appreciate you inviting me.
Ross, one of the things that you are best known for saying, and it makes up an entire chapter 2 of the book, is kids do well if they can. For parents who are struggling with children who are inflexible and rigid, and let's face it, just a little bit frustrating and even explosive, the idea that kids do well if they can is both comforting and confronting, because it's comforting, meaning, well, the kids are doing the best that they can and they just can't do it right now. But it's also frustrating from the point of view that, well, why can't they do it? Like they did it yesterday or they did it last week. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this idea of kids do well if they can?
There's a lot of science behind kids do well if they can. A lot of research, not on kids do well if they can specifically, but research telling us why kids who have concerning behaviors aren't doing well. And what the research tells us, of course, is that they are lacking crucial skills: flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, problem solving, emotion regulation.
Well, I'm going to pause you right there, Ross. Can we talk about each of those 5 things? Because it's so easy to sit here in a podcast and go, yeah, okay, my kids don't have frustration tolerance, they don't have flexibility, adaptability, emotion regulation. Everyone nods their heads, but it's worth taking 30 seconds on each of them and saying, here's what they are and here's why they're lacking them. Can we please do that? That's so, to me, really important.
I don't often get the chance to do that. Flexibility and adaptability refers to your ability to deal with changes.
They don't like that, right? Like when you're at the park with the kids and you say it's time to go home, they're kind of in their own little world. They're saying, but I like it here and now you're asking me to change.
Right. And some kids are going to pout about it. Some kids are going to go right along with it. That's their personality. But kids who are lacking the skills of flexibility and adaptability are going to get very upset by demands for change, especially if after we demand that they shift gears quickly and they don't shift gears quickly, all we do is insist harder or push harder that they shift quickly. And then you have concerning behavior. Concerning behavior occurs anytime you're placing demands on kids that they're lacking the skills to handle. So there's flexibility, adaptability. Many of us take that skill for granted. I would say demands for flexibility and adaptability for most human beings happen many dozens of times every day, probably more so for kids because we adults are so keen on telling them what to do. Frustration tolerance. All of us gets frustrated. How you manage that, whether you use your words, which we say to 2-year-olds, but which many of the kids I work with who are 15 still haven't mastered. The ability to continue thinking clearly, even if you are frustrated. Crucial skill. We use it dozens of times every day. Easy to take for granted unless you or your kid is lacking that skill. Problem solving. In my opinion, it should come first. Problem solving, I think, if you twisted my arm behind my back and said, Ross, most important skill for life, problem solving.
When you talk through these skills, and we'll tie it back to kids do well if they can in a sec. Well, actually, I guess this does tie in. There's a phrase that I use all the time with parents when I'm chatting about how we can help our kids navigate big emotions, but also how we can navigate our own big emotions. And that is that this is a shortcut. I know that you'll probably resist at least part of what I'm saying here, but for simplicity's sake, I'll say to parents, high emotions equals low intelligence. The more emotional we become, the harder it is to think clearly, to problem solve, to deal with the frustration, to regulate and step through it. And And so I guess when we talk about an explosive child, the entire book and even the concept of kids do well if they can ultimately comes down to let's help kids to, and let's help us as adults to keep our emotions in check so that we can solve problems effectively.
Correct. In early editions of The Explosive Child, I used to write that kids lost about 40 IQ points in the midst of frustration. The reason I took it out is because people were taking it literally and asking me, where's the research on that?
Right.
No, it's a metaphor.
Yeah.
It's a metaphor, but it goes to what you're saying. And then emotion regulation. Emotion regulation is huge. Life is full of anxieties and frustrations and sadness. These are all good emotions because they can propel us into action, says the research. But the other thing the research says is that if we feel those emotions too strongly, they can shut us down and make it harder for us to think. So those are the global skills. The research has identified literally hundreds of skills frequently found lacking in kids with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. Why do I say kids do well if they can? Because if you have those skills, you're probably doing pretty well. And if you don't, you'd very much like to be doing well, but something's getting in your way.
What I love about that phrase as well, Ross, is kids do well if they can says we should trust in the implicit, in the innate desire of children to do well. They want to do well, but they have these challenges, these difficulties, these skills that are yet to be developed.
Here's the thing about that. That becomes philosophical. And sometimes in philosophical discussions, there is no outcome because now you're dueling about philosophies. The lagging skills research, and there are hundreds of studies now, for me, seals the philosophical debate. There is no philosophical debate. Kids do well if they can, wins. And I'm not into winning and losing. I'm just saying if the alternative philosophy is kids do well if they wanna, and that's going to lead us to thinking that this kid doesn't want to do well. And that's going to lead us to thinking it's our job to make the kid want to do well. The lagging skills research puts that mentality to rest. It's been very popular for a very long time. So I like engaging in philosophical discussions, but that's one that should have ended a very long time ago, thanks to the literature on lagging skills in kids with concerning behaviors.
Dr. Ross Greene. He is the author of The Explosive Child and an associate clinical professor at Harvard Medical School. What I'm hearing you say is some people will say it's a question of motivation. Others will say it's a question of ability. You're highlighting this is an issue of ability. Kids will do well if they have the ability. It's not whether they're motivated to or not. They just don't have the ability. And I would throw in here as well, context is everything. Just because a child has the ability at 7:30 a.m. doesn't mean that they'll have the ability at 6:30 p.m.
Correct. So there's always life's contextual factors that can make you look better and more capable under some conditions and not others. No doubt about it. I'm much better at 7:30 a.m. than I am at 7:30 p.m. Luckily, we're doing this early enough for me to still have some brain cells left. But you get the idea.
Very much. So lagging skills. Lagging skills simply means that things like frustration tolerance, flexibility and adaptability, problem solving, emotion regulation have not yet been developed. So right now, every parent of a child who is explosive, every parent of a child who is rigid, every parent of a child who has additional needs, maybe they've got a diagnosis, they're on the spectrum, ADHD, whatever it could be, every parent right now is listening to us and saying, well, how do I give them the skills? I need them to have the skills tonight, right now, please. Obviously, skills don't develop after listening to a brief podcast. It's for a time-poor parent who really does want answers right now. But if we wanted to develop the skill of flexibility and adaptability, now you've got a couple of kids. I have 6 kids. You know what it's like when a child becomes intensely rigid, narrow-minded, tunnel-visioned, and what they believe is the way that it is, and no amount of logic will convince them. How do we work with a child who is inflexible and teach them that skill of psychological flexibility?
All right. This is going to take a minute.
Okay.
I don't know if that is a skill that can be taught through direct instruction, though I know many people try. I think it is a skill that is taught more through a process. And the process that we use to enhance that skill is problem solving, solving problems collaboratively. So let me just rewind the tape a second. The kids who we're thinking about right now don't look bad all the time. They only look bad some of the time. When do they look bad? When expectations are being placed upon them that they're having difficulty meeting. That could be anything from difficulty turning off the Xbox to come in for dinner, to difficulty getting out of bed by 7 a.m. to go to school, to difficulty eating what mom or dad has made for dinner. Those are all expectations. If a kid is having difficulty meeting an expectation, we have a problem that needs to be solved. We call those unsolved problems. And as you know, but maybe some of your listeners don't, the collaborative and proactive solutions model articulates a very systematic way of solving problems collaboratively and proactively with kids. So the good news is that once a problem is solved, it doesn't cause concerning behavior anymore. That's good. Both the problem is solved and the concerning behavior has subsided, both very good things. But the process of solving problems with kids collaboratively and outside the heat of the moment, proactively, also gives kids practice at, models for them, and enhances the very skills that they're lacking. So now to your question. In the case of flexibility, adaptability, let's say we've got a kid who's a very concrete, literal, black and white, rigid thinker. They've already got the solution to that problem, right? But we don't want to hear about their solution yet. We want to hear what's making it hard for them to meet the expectation first. It would sound like this. I've noticed you've been having difficulty brushing your teeth before going to bed at night. What's up? That's the beginning of the first of the 3 steps that are involved in solving a problem collaboratively. Let's say this very rigid kid then says, oh, no, I'm having trouble brushing my teeth before I go to bed at night. I've got my way of doing it, and that's my way of doing it. That's not any typical response, right? The parent would then say, yes, but I'm interested in knowing what's hard for you about meeting that expectation. Now we're on a different subject. Now we're not on the kid's solution now. We've rewound the tape a little bit back to what's making it hard for them. In the second step, the adult is entering their concern into consideration, why we think it's important that the expectation be met. In the third step, we're putting our heads together and collaborating on a solution, but one that addresses the concerns of both parties. So what happened in that process for that kid? Number one, they felt heard. This is not my solution versus your solution. It's let's hear your concerns. Let's hear what's getting in your way. Then I'm going to tell you my concerns. So we're listening to each other. We're modeling. We're practicing listening, empathizing, taking another person's perspective. And then when we get to that third step and we discover that the kid's original solution and the adult's original solution could not conceivably address the concerns of both parties and that we need a different solution, well, the kid has just gotten one rep in the skill of flexibility, adaptability, also one rep on problem solving, one rep on frustration tolerance. And if we did this proactively instead of the heat of the moment, probably some skills that are going to help them regulate their emotions down the road if we get them good enough at this. So, in answer to your question, I told you it was going to take a while. How do you teach skills when you're implementing collaborative and proactive solutions? By solving problems collaboratively and proactively, just by engaging kids in that process. We model, practice, and enhance those skills. I should mention one other thing. It's not just the kid who's getting practice at those skills.
There are 2 things that I want to pick up on here. One of them is a comment. I guess it's a little bit self-referential. Your 3 elements where you sit down and say, hey, I've noticed this. There's some difficulty here. what's up. In the model that I developed, I would call that explore. We're literally exploring their world. The next thing that you said is when they provide some resistance or when we're not really making any progress, you say, it's fine, but here's what we need. You talked about how we're outlining the expectation. I call that explain. So we've got an exploration, then an explanation. And then when you have that problem solving, that collaborative conversation, I call that empower. So I call that the 3 E's. It's essentially the same model. You and I, Ross, we're twins. We're teaching the same thing, but with different words.
But got a much better tan than I do. But anyways, keep going.
Right. But this concept is so foreign to so many parents who have been raised with the idea that if they're not doing it, and I've got books on my shelf from very well-known, incredibly well-educated parenting experts who essentially are saying if the kids won't do as they're told, parent harder. You've just got to parent harder. You've got to push more. You've got to raise the stakes. That's more of an observation and a reflection on what you've shared that I just wanted to sort of, I guess, for my Happy Families audience to tie together the way that you're describing it and the way that I do. I think it makes it's wonderfully mutually reinforcing. The thing that I do want to pull out of there, though, is I'm listening really carefully to the language that you use. And I feel that you are very careful, explicitly careful about the language you're using. For example, you're talking about a child who's having difficulty or challenge. You're talking about lagging skills. You're talking about the collaborative, proactive way that we engage. Would you just talk a little bit about the language that you're using and the specific words such as difficult behavior?
I try not to be judgmental. I find that there's many ways of talking about kids with concerning behaviors that can be loaded. But the biggest reason I choose my words carefully is that because this is such a dramatic departure for so many people, it can be misunderstood quickly, often by people who are taking what they're doing already and saying, all right, this sounds good. How do I force what I'm hearing now into what I'm doing already? And I don't want my language to lend to confusion. I don't want to add to the confusion by being imprecise. This is hard enough of a transition for many caregivers without me confusing them with my own language. So, I'm going to talk about difficult behavior. I'm not going to use terms that are more loaded than that. Especially because since I don't think the kid is doing this to, now here we go, right? Push our buttons, yank our chains, test limits, manipulate us, coerce us into capitulating to their wishes. I find those are very loaded terms, very judgmental, that suggest that we actually know what's behind what's going on with the kid. None of that based in research. We're solid. This is a kid who's lacking skills. I want to make sure that I am referring to this kid in the most humane, compassionate, enlightened, non-judgmental way possible.
I love the respect for the humanity of the child that is in your approach. We'll continue the conversation tomorrow as we find out what we can do when our children are driving us crazy in the heat of the moment, and also we'll unpack the truth about consequences. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rowland from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And for more info about making your family happier, check out Ross's website, livesinthebalance.org, and happyfamilies.com.au. More of this conversation tomorrow.